All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the second Thursday of 2025. This series is brought to you by the Friends of the Cabildo and the Louisiana State Museum. I'm Chris Cook. I'm the Director of Education for the Louisiana State Museum in New Orleans. And I'm excited to bring to you tonight our guest, Thomas Patterson, presenting on his forthcoming book, comes out next month, American Populist. Huey Long, hold on. I want to quote the whole title, and I left it over here. Excuse me. American Populist, Huey Long of Louisiana. I was about to say Huey Long of America. Well, maybe that's the start of a question for the Q&A. A couple of reminders before we get started. I'm going to ask everyone to stay muted throughout the presentation. If you have any questions, type them into the chat as they come up. I'll be monitoring the chat, and when we kick off the live Q&A at the end of the presentation, I'm going to prime the well by reading the questions that came into the chat first. Usually in the order that they come in, but I may group them thematically if that makes sense. But the main message here is type your questions into the chat. We'll get to them first. Also, a reminder to check out the Friends of the Cabildo, the sponsors of this series. We've got a lot of really great volunteer and membership opportunities, and they also have another monthly lecture series. If you enjoy this one, that's just for members. So check out the Friends of the Cabildo. One of the ways they sponsor this series is by providing an honorarium for our guest speakers. And this month's speaker, in lieu of an honorarium, had the idea to raffle off some books. So we're going to be selecting 3 lucky winners from our live audience. So if you're listening to me right now, you're in the running. We're going to use a random generator to select, and we'll announce the winners and how you redeem your prize when we get to the end of the Q&A. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce tonight's speaker, Thomas Patterson, who was inspired to write a book about Huey Long, despite the fact that there have been many works on Huey Long, some of them nonfiction, some of them fiction. But in the years since Huey Long's death, his reputation has often been mostly in the realm of caricature. So our speaker was inspired to go back to primary sources, excuse me, and start from scratch and envisioning who this man was and what his legacy really is. In addition to being a writer, Thomas Patterson is a lawyer and the founder of the Patterson Law Firm in Chicago, Illinois, where he's joining us from tonight. And with that, I'm going to share the spotlight and turn it over to our speaker. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate the museum, Louisiana State Museum at New Orleans, and Chris Cook, its Director of Education, for inviting me to speak about Huey Long. I am a lawyer in Chicago, and at various non-sequential times, Chicago has been ruled by very powerful mayors named daily. In fact, the father and son in non-consecutive periods have ruled Chicago for decades, and they were often called dictators. Before I lived in Chicago, I lived in Virginia, where I spent my teenage years, and Virginia was ruled by the Harry Byrd political machine, less famous, but equally powerful. Of course, I'm sure that living under these alleged dictators had nothing to do with my interest in Huey Long. I actually became interested in Huey Long when I read the T. Harry Williams biography in the early 1970s. And then I saw the Ken Burns documentary in the mid-1980s. And I have this vague memory of seeing All the King's Men, the original movie, on a TV rerun and being inspired or awestruck by Broderick Crawford's great speech. Listen to me, you hicks. And I suppose that maybe I was interested in it for that reason. The later books were written by Professors Hare, Brinkley, and Richard White, most recently in 2006. And they took issue with a lot of what T. Harry Williams had written. And so I was intrigued and wondering about what the true answers were, whether I could get answers to the questions that they posed, or whether I could reconcile the disagreements between the various authors. I had also, I was influenced by the fact of the 2008 financial crash, and later books by Piketty and Stiglitz, which decried the concentration of wealth that they perceived in the United States. And of course, the unjust distribution of wealth and power was the centerpiece of Huey Long's contentions 90 years ago. And it seemed to me that maybe these issues were being resurrected or resuscitated long after Huey's death. I had spent 3 years writing a 600-page peer-reviewed book for lawyers that was published by the American Bar Association. And so I thought, well, I could take 3 years and reevaluate Huey and get my questions answered. That was in 2013. I think I was as successful estimating the time it would take to write this book as some lawyers are in estimating the amount of legal fees that they are going to charge. One of the reasons I didn't think it would take that long was that the main features of Huey's life are well understood, at least by Louisianans, but I can recap them briefly here for the non-Louisiana people in the audience. And I promise the Louisianans that I won't take very long to do so. Huey was born in 1893 in the middle of the worst depression of the 19th century. He was born in a little town of Winfield in northern Louisiana in a log cabin to a poor family. And that was Baptist country, and it was small farmer country, not a wealthy section of the state. At age 16, he left home and became a traveling salesman, traveling states from Tennessee to Texas. He did that for 4 years. In 1914 and 15, he took a couple of semesters of law school at Tulane University in New Orleans, and then he studied for the bar on his own, and he became a licensed lawyer in May of 1915 at age 21. He then built a successful law practice, and 3 years later, he ran for election to what was then called the Railroad Commission. It was the state commission constitutionally established that regulates utilities in Louisiana. It is now called the Public Service Commission. At the time, it had 3 members, and he ran for the northern Louisiana territory of the commission. He won by 635 votes, not an overwhelming mandate, to be sure. But he immediately attracted attention all over the state because he actually attacked the utilities he was regulating. He attacked the phone companies, gas companies, and most notably of all, a Standard Oil Company. And he obtained quite a bit of notoriety in enforcing the law and regulating the rates of those entities. And the notoriety and fame that he obtained allowed him to win election as governor of Louisiana in 1928, 10 years later. His first year as governor of Louisiana was extremely successful, albeit with a very limited program. He forced the adoption of a law providing free school books to children, an act that increased school enrollment between 10 and 20%. And he also opened night schools for adult illiterates, substantially reducing the illiteracy rate for both white and black individuals in Louisiana. He also passed a law to allow natural gas to be imported into New Orleans, something prior governors had promised but never done, and which was a substantial economic benefit to both consumers and business in New Orleans. And he passed a small bond issue to construct modern concrete and asphalt highways, something that a bond issue had never been provided for before, and in fact required a constitutional amendment to implement. But this was all done in an atmosphere of controversy. In 1929, he was impeached on charges ranging from embezzlement and misappropriation of state funds and bribery to cursing. And he escaped that removal from office by the skin of his teeth. And then to establish or reestablish his influence over the electorate, he ran for the United States Senate in 1930 and won a substantial victory. But he remained in control of Louisiana's state government, and he elected a compliant ally as governor after he left the office. This person's name was Governor Oscar Kelly Allen. His nickname was OK Allen, and it was appropriate in this case because he okayed whatever Huey wanted done. And in Louisiana, they proceeded to further provide public works for the state. They built not just the few miles of roads from the 1928 bond issue, but they floated an additional bond issue, and they built over 2,000 miles of highways, concrete and asphalt. They employed at one time 10% of the entire country's road work force in Louisiana building these highways, and it cushioned the effect of the Depression in Louisiana. They also built the new state capitol, which at 34 stories tall is not only today the tallest state capitol in the country, but at the time it was the tallest building in the entire South. He built a new airport. He improved the port of New Orleans. He founded a new medical hospital or medical school at Louisiana State University, and he radically expanded Louisiana State University. They had a huge influx of talented professors, including Robert Penn Warren, who joined LSU in 1934. And of course, Huey took direct control of the band and the football team, telling the coaches what plays to call and leading the band at Mardi Gras and other official events. At one event, he was leading the band, and the policeman tried to stop him at a crosswalk, and he said, "Stand back. This is the Kingfish." And he led the band right through the crosswalk and continued on with the parade. He took the entire student body, about 5,000 to 7,000 people at the time, on special railroad cars to Nashville so that they could watch a football game. And they attracted a crowd of 80,000 people in Tennessee while they did that. And Huey led the band on a concert at the park in Nashville. And it was interesting that the Attorney General of Tennessee would not let Huey bring the Louisiana State Troopers with guns into Tennessee. So Huey contacted the Tennessee game warden, and the Tennessee game warden politely allowed Huey's state troopers to carry guns, and he gave them special badges in the LSU colors and said that they should feel free to guard whatever wildlife they saw fit while they were in Nashville. So he was quite a showman. When he joined the United States Senate in 1932, he was an unknown senator for the most part. But he made a splash in the United States Senate, and he then endorsed Franklin Roosevelt to be president. And he was instrumental at the Democratic National Convention in 1932 in getting Roosevelt nominated. Many people say that without Huey's help, Roosevelt would not have been nominated. And then Huey campaigned for him to be elected president in several Western states, North and South Dakota, Kansas, Nebraska, in the fall of 1932. When Roosevelt was elected, however, Roosevelt proposed very conservative policies in 1933 after he was inaugurated. He proposed a very weak banking act, and he proposed a terrible $400 million cut to veterans' benefits. Huey opposed the cuts to veterans, which infuriated Roosevelt, and he proposed amendments to the Banking Act that Roosevelt proposed, some of which were adopted. The most notable of them is the bank insurance of bank deposits, which some writers call the most successful feature of the New Deal. But it's generally forgotten now that Roosevelt opposed the insurance of bank deposits, but it was forced on him by Huey, Arthur Vandenberg, and some other senators who led the fight to insure the bank deposits. So Huey, being upset at Roosevelt's initial conservatism and his failure to increase taxes on the wealthy, in 1934, Huey formed Share Our Wealth societies. Anyone could form one. They just had to write to his office and obtain the membership materials. These societies grew like wildfire. By September 1935, there were 9 million members estimated in these societies. They had at least one member in every county, in every state in the country. And this was at a time when 20 million or so votes could conceivably carry a presidential election. So can imagine, with 9 million people signed up as members, never mind the additional fans that he had from listening to his radio speeches, you can imagine that Roosevelt was frightened that Huey Long was a real threat to his potential renomination and election in 1936. And Huey did threaten to run as a third party against Roosevelt and whoever the Republicans nominated. So Roosevelt in 1935 tried to steal Huey's thunder. The Social Security Act is a result of Huey's advocacy, and he increased the tax rates on the wealthy and provided additional funds for college students. And this was also an effort to steal Huey's thunder. Not only did Roosevelt move to steal some of his ideas to try to steal his thunder, but he also engaged the IRS in a political prosecution of Huey and his allies for tax law violations. And he engaged the FBI to monitor Louisiana legislative sessions. And he politicized all relief expenditures in Louisiana, telling the relief recipients who they should vote for and giving special coupons to people who supervised them. In response, Huey tightened his hold on Louisiana's government, not only over the state legislature, but also over municipalities. In 1935, he controlled the hiring and firing of teachers, firemen, policemen in every municipality in Louisiana, in addition to his hold over the state patronage jobs. If you think about it, this cannibalization of local government allowed him to increase his patronage to fight the Roosevelt relief recipients' expenditures, but he could do so without increasing the total tax load of the state. But all of these actions were extremely controversial. The Louisiana electorate was polarized, divided, and there were plenty of threats of violence. One person threatened to kidnap Huey Long, and the lieutenant governor was quoted in the newspapers as saying if he was kidnapped, he would pardon the kidnappers. Another individual, later a judge, said that if it was necessary to protect Louisiana liberties at the end of a rope, he, for one, was willing to swing that rope. And of course, he had a rope with him as a prop when he gave those kinds of speeches. Ultimately, Huey was assassinated in September of 1935, shot on September 8th, died on September 10th at age 42, just after his 42nd birthday. So that, in a nutshell, is the biography of Huey for the people that aren't from Louisiana and didn't know much about him. Now, Winston Churchill said writing was an adventure. He said it would start out as a toy, then become an amusement, then become a mistress, then become a master, and then become a tyrant. He said, just when you were reconciled to a life of eternal servitude, you would kill that monster and then fling that monster out to the public. I don't know if I would describe the process of writing this biography of Huey Long in that way, but I will say that this is the closest I have ever come to understanding what it is like to be pregnant. And the due date is February for the book, and I'm hoping that I will avoid a postpartum depression. The writing of the book was actually fun in many ways. There were some great descriptions of Huey and of Louisiana that I really enjoyed quoting. It was well known that Huey was a very flashy dresser. And so one of his appearances in the United States Senate, the writer said, Huey appeared in the Senate as a sartorial aurora borealis. And another writer covered a morning meeting that Huey held in his bathrobe, pajamas, and slippers. And they said Huey looked like an explosion in a paint factory. So I enjoyed those kinds of quotes. It was also well known that he inspired a lot of raucous, violent tinged hearings and meetings. And one New York Times writer wrote that Louisianans must survive on a diet of roast pelican stuffed with firecrackers. So that's the kind of inspiration that Huey provided to the writers of his day. I also enjoyed Huey's sense of humor as well, even though some of it is a little bit old-fashioned now. At a political meeting in Arkansas outdoors, Huey's speech was interrupted by a dog barking. And Huey interrupted his speech, stopped it, and said, "You know, that dog barking reminded him of a boarding house." And he said, when the boarding house dinner bell rang, this dog began to howl. And one of the boarders said, "What are you howling for? You don't have to eat it." On another occasion, Huey displayed the gift of bringing the exalted rich people down to earth. So the chief executive officer of the United Fruit Company was, in Huey's phrase, a banana peddler. In another case, the mayor of New Orleans at the time, a political opponent, had passed a tax ordinance. It taxed awnings and some other things, and then it taxed something called sniper signs. And the mayor was asked, "What is a sniper sign?" And the mayor of New Orleans said he didn't know what a sniper sign was. He had copied a tax ordinance from Baltimore without reading it or without understanding it, and he included sniper signs without knowing what exactly they were. So Huey's newspaper had a lot of fun with that. They said, "Well, Mr. Mayor, why don't you tax other things about which you were totally ignorant? Like, why don't you tax ring-tailed gollywogs? Why don't you tax Malibassawiches? Why don't you tax Loggerwaggoranians?" I could just see some farmer somewhere reading this thing saying, "Yeah, Mr. Mayor, what the heck are you doing? You know, why don't you go tax some Loggerwaggoranians," right? And it was a kind of reducing an opponent's phrasing to absurdity, a technique that was also displayed by Abraham Lincoln, and which is captured in some ways in Gary Wills's book, Lincoln at Gettysburg. Well, anyway, aside from having some fun and enjoying Huey's humor and the descriptions of other writers, I had a couple of purposes in writing the book. First, I wanted to make Huey accessible. And I have three examples of that. Let's take first his public speaking. Every writer that writes about Huey says he was this spectacular public speaker. He could mesmerize an audience. He could convince people against their will. There were people reportedly that had to leave his presentations because they said, "Well, he's starting to convince me. I had to get out." And everybody says he had charisma. And so I wondered about the speaking ability in a little bit more detail, because none of the books really explain how he became a great speaker or what his ideas were based on primarily. And so I looked, where did he get his ideas from? His primary idea in politics was the redistribution of wealth, that the top 1% of the people had too much money and everybody else didn't have enough of it. He wanted more equal opportunity, not equal outcomes, but equal opportunity. That was his guiding principle throughout his career. But where did he get that idea? Well, in 1906, Theodore Roosevelt gave a speech called "The Man with the Muckrake," in which he advocated limiting the fortunes of the wealthy. Woodrow Wilson, when he was president, increased the tax rate on the wealthy, and the critics gasped at this redistribution of wealth. In 1916, an Industrial Relations Commission said that the primary cause of industrial unrest, was the unjust distribution of wealth and income. And they claimed that 1% of the people owned 59% of the wealth. William Allen White, a Republican editor of a newspaper in Kansas, advocated limiting inheritances. Historian, famous at the time, John Truslow Adams, the historian who first coined the term "the American dream," described the system in the United States as being extremely unjust, and he thought that 12 industrialists controlled 90% of the industrial activity in the United States. So all of these ideas were out there, and there were other people that advocated them, not just them. But I thought those ideas were notable. He didn't just concoct his idea for limiting fortunes based on some discussion around the Cracker Barrel at Winfield. These were advocated by major political figures and presidents in the United States at the time. And I think that it is easier to be persuasive if you are building on an idea that is prevalent at the time. So I don't know what I would describe as a prevalent idea today, so I cannot give advice as to how somebody should build on some prevalent idea. But that's a key insight into Huey's persuasiveness, is that he was building on prevalent ideas that were current and in circulation at the time he came of age and later in politics. The second part of his public speaking was practice. He gave a ton of speeches. He spoke at his campaign for Railroad Commission in 1918. Then he campaigned in the same district for 2 months to try to elect John Parker as governor of Louisiana in 1919. Then in 1920, he campaigned against the Constitutional Convention. Then in 1921, he campaigned for a judicial candidate. Someone giving that quantity of speeches just might improve. And if you look at other great communicators or people with that reputation, take Ronald Reagan, for example. He gave hundreds of speeches for General Electric Company, in addition to his stints as a movie star and on the General Electric weekly television show. Whether you think Donald Trump is a great communicator or not, he clearly has a mastery of modern media that he's obtained from his promotion of real estate projects and from his time on the TV show The Apprentice. I don't say that if you practice a lot, you can become charismatic, but I do say that you might not be able to become charismatic without a lot of practice. There are other aspects to Huey's speaking that I relate in the book, but I think that gives you the general idea that I'm trying to go beyond the caricature that he's a spellbinding orator and explain what the mechanics of becoming that orator actually were. Let's go beyond that and also examine some of his personal characteristics. Yeah, I was very surprised that I could break down some of his personal characteristics. He disregarded ridicule, reprimands, rebukes. He never played it safe. He always risked everything on what he was trying to do. And he would get things done. And I have separate chapters illustrating these points. Chapter 4 discusses the rebukes, ridicule, and reprimand. 5, refusing to play it safe. And 6, getting things done. And preceding all that, of course, was he measured and planned what he was trying to do. He measured everything. His wife, Rose, said that he told her he had planned his political career. He was going to have a secondary state office, then he was going to become governor, then senator, then president. T. Harry Williams said that she kind of shivered as she recalled it all because she said he was measuring it all. Now, he had other characteristics that are more interspersed throughout the book. He had a tremendous enthusiasm, optimism, energy, grit, resiliency. It was amazing to see him rebound from some political defeats. He studied. Professor Glenn Johnson said that Huey never studied, but his personal papers revealed that he did. He had an abstract for constitutional law at the Tulane Law School that was 22 pages long, single-spaced, typed on 8.5 by 14-inch paper. He studied. He used to abstract excerpt sentences from even novels and other books that he read if he thought the sentence was well expressed, and he would write them in the back of the book and then memorize them. He studied. There was in 1935, a magazine author or writer said that Huey made observations that were impossible without an understanding of the formal literature on the subject. He once told a story in which he said there wasn't another politician in the world who could name 100 men that he was absolutely sure of except Huey. And I thought that was a very interesting concept, that he had memorized 100 people that he could count on. And I wonder how many CEOs uh, could name their 100 most important vendors or customers or even employees. And I wonder how much better their performance would be if they could do that. His personal growth has been unappreciated, as has the amount of reading that he did. If you look at his career, I mean, he went from traveling salesman to lawyer. He went from regulating utilities to becoming governor. He went from school books and highways to college education and medical school development. And then he went to the United States Senate, and he concentrated on the single issue of taxation in 1932 and 1933. But eventually, he proposed extreme uh, proposals relating to the supply of money, relating to the amount of public works, relating to minimum incomes per family, veterans benefits, and Social Security benefits. I mean, it's astounding. I don't know if the personal growth he had, is dramatic as the personal growth of, say, someone like Malcolm X, who went from criminal to religious leader to believing in brotherhood. But it's there, and it is quite impressive, at least to me. So you can judge his personal characteristics, and I think that makes him more accessible to everyone. You can look at them and you can copy them or analyze them and see if they would work for you. Now, the third aspect of making him more accessible was to look at his advocacy. And I was shocked at how similar his approach was to the modern academic theories of social movements or revolution. There were 4 stages to his advocacy. 1, he would recognize a grievance. 2, he would research and then propose a solution. 3, he would then engage in a massive mobilization campaign to try to get his ideas across. And 4, he was never shied away from confronting in a dramatic way his biggest opponent. And you can see this in widely separate acts. So as a private lawyer, first-year lawyer in 1916, he tried to reform the workers' compensation laws. He recognized that they were providing paltry benefits to people in Louisiana, and there was widespread but underlying dissatisfaction with it. He wrote to the railway union newsletter and asked them what a good law would look like. He ended up drafting a law. He provided it to his local state senator, who proposed it in the Louisiana legislature. And then he engaged in a massive mobilization campaign, writing letters to public officials all over the place, asking them to endorse his changes, his proposed changes in the workers' compensation law. He collected over 400 letters in support and offered to provide them to the governor. And if 400 letters doesn't sound like much today, but there was no internet, there were not good roads, everybody didn't have a telephone. It's amazing that he was able to collect so many letters of support from a wide variety of people. And then when he accompanied the state senator to the legislature, and they kind of ridiculed and made fun of him, he ended up standing up and denouncing them as tools of the corporate interests. And of course, they made short shrift of his workers' compensation reforms, but the entire legislature overruled the committee and adopted them. So here you can see the elements. He recognized the grievance, he proposed a solution, he engaged in a massive mobilization campaign, and he confronted the legislature and accused them of being corporate tools. 16 years later, in the United States Senate, he was new and unknown. He thought that the primary difficulty with the Great Depression was that the rich were not paying their fair share of taxes. He engaged in a massive self-education campaign, reading a variety of books on the topic. You can see the receipts of the books that he ordered and read before he gave major speeches on the topic of taxing the rich more heavily. And you can see that some of his early speeches only sparsely were lauded with authorities, and his later speeches included many more authorities. So you can see that the intense research that he was undertaking at the time. He also engaged in public relations stunts. And when the leader of his party in the United States Senate, Joseph Robinson of Arkansas, opposed Huey's resolution. He dramatically denounced Robinson on the floor of the Senate, even though he was a member of his own party from a neighboring state, and he resigned all his committee appointments that Robinson had given him as minority leader as a protest of it. And he obtained wide publicity for that and was a pariah in his own party until he endorsed Roosevelt and helped Roosevelt get nominated. So you can see that 16 years apart in widely different circumstances, he provided the same four elements of his advocacy. And there are many more examples that I could cite. So look, I did not write a self-help book. That wasn't my purpose. But I think if I had read the book that I just wrote 40 or 50 years ago, I probably would have had a more successful career. Huey's life has aspects that can be studied and analyzed, compared to other people, other famous biography type people, or whatever, and you can learn from it. The original title, the working title of the book was Deconstructing Huey Long, and I think that I've tried to deconstruct some of his personality and some of his advocacy into the discrete elements so that he's not some great figure at a distance, but he's someone that we can relate to and borrow from and analyze what he did. My second purpose is a more common purpose. I wanted to resolve some of the disputes among the historians. We've already seen one dispute. Did he study? Glenn Johnson, the professor, said he did not. I say he did. Glenn Johnson and Richard White said that Huey voted against all progressive legislation authored by Roosevelt. That is wrong. And I studied the congressional record at great length to prove that I'm right. But those are more minor disputes. Let's look at what I think is one major dispute. Alan Brinkley, in his book Voices of Protest, it's a very well done book. I enjoyed it immensely. But he concluded that Huey was a backwards looking, nostalgic looking populist, that his proposals were a timid proposal that was not persuasive to people, in that they were given in the twilight of the populist movement, and that he was trying to restrict an economic consolidation that could not be restricted. In other words, he was going to hearken back to an economy that could not be rejuvenated, could not be revived. And therefore, he wasn't really a progressive thinker. And I just think that's just dead wrong. I think Huey was far ahead of his time on economics as well as other things. For example, Huey advocated expansion of the money supply in massive public works projects to help ameliorate the effect of the Depression. And his road program in Louisiana did ameliorate the effect of the Depression. And they've measured that. So those ideas are well accepted now, but they were not accepted at the time by Roosevelt or by other establishment economists. His Share Our Wealth Society program advocated a minimum income and homestead for families. If you Google minimum income advocates today, you will find an astonishing list of government officials, Republicans and Democrats, and economists and business titans who advocate a minimum income per family. It was a progressive idea that ought to be considered today. He advocated free college educations or vocational training for those able to do the work. That idea is a centerpiece of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders' campaign runs today. And you can see the advocacy today for forgiving student loans, which is an offshoot of the same idea. As I've mentioned briefly, the Social Security Act, a modern act, or at least everybody says so, was, according to Roosevelt advisor Rexford Guy Tugwell, and according to Lyndon Johnson, who was a young official in D.C. at the time, was due to Huey's advocacy, that it never would have passed but for their fear that Huey was going to recruit support for an even more radical old age pension proposals. The GI Bill of 1944, according to the leading scholar of veteran activism, a professor named Stephen Ortiz, said that the irony of the GI Bill of 1944 passed under Roosevelt was that it copied almost exactly Huey's Share Our Wealth plan in 1934. I do admit that Huey's proposal to tax fortunes or restrict fortunes has faded from view today. But in my opinion, this is due to the fact that the World War II deficit spending caused a redistribution of wealth in the United States, not purposefully, but just by accident. If you increase the supply of money, the money of the wealthy is going to be worth less. And if that money is paid to previously unemployed or underemployed workers to build tanks and jeeps and bomber planes and so forth, they're going to have more money. And relatively speaking, then the rich are going to have less of a share of the national income than everybody else than they had previously before the World War II deficit spending. I don't say that government spending is always a good idea. I don't say that war spending is always a good idea. It depends on the circumstances. In the 1940s, the economy was not working at capacity or anything close to capacity. So inflating the money supply and spending it on armaments or anything else would have defeated the Depression and would have relieved the unjust distribution of wealth and income that Huey contended existed at the time. So I don't think any of these ideas are nostalgic. I think they're insightful. I think they were progressive. I think they were ahead of his time. So I don't see the, I just violently disagree with the opinion that he was a nostalgic, backwards looking populist in the twilight of a hopeless effort to, or quixotic effort to restore the economy as it was before industrialization and technological change. All right, let's go to the other side of the ledger, however. Huey has been attacked for an oil company that obtained state leases. It was called the Win or Lose Oil Company, and they obtained one lease during Huey's life and many leases after Huey's death, and they were controversial. In around 2010 or 2011, 2012, there was an enormous Fox News expose about these win or lose leases. And in response to that Fox News expose, the State Mineral Board in 2013 conducted and published a massive analysis of all of these leases. And they said that, look, the state royalties were obtained. The state did not lose any money on these leases. And all of these leases were obtained according to law and public bidding at the time. With respect to one lease and its amendment, I disagree with the State Mineral Board's report. And it relates to the fact that this lease was originally let for 50 wells to be drilled, but it was sublet to only have 30 wells drilled, and they assigned the other rights to the 20 lease tracts to individuals for a substantial profit of $320,000 when those people did not have any intention of drilling because it would have diminished the oil from other wells that they had in the vicinity. And the state officials amended that lease at the time so that they only had to drill 30 instead of the 50 wells. And I say that the state officials that did that and got money for it breached their fiduciary duties, and it was illegal. So I disagree with the State Mineral Board report on that. I don't know exactly what Huey's involvement was because of his death. His death occurred before his involvement could be precisely clarified. But there's no question that Oscar Kelly Allen breached his fiduciary duties, and maybe other state officials did as well. And maybe anybody conspiring with them could have been held to account. The lease was ultimately recovered by the state in 1945. Now, there's another tantalizing aspect that many writers have written. That is, did Huey make an agreement with mobster Frank Costello to allow slot machines into New Orleans? Williams says he did not. Russell Long said that he didn't, that Costello mentioned a meeting with Huey, but he was covering for an agreement he made with the later Louisiana leader. The slot machines appeared and disappeared and appeared and disappeared at various times throughout 1935, and it really depended on whether the police were doing their job or not. But on September 6, 1935, it was stated that the head of what became the state police was going to confiscate all the slot machines. And on September 7th, 1935, all the slot machines in the state were confiscated. And then, of course, Huey was shot on September 8th. So we don't really know what Huey had intended. Now, if we believe the mobster Frank Costello, and I mean, that's a big question. Do you believe a mobster? I mean, even if he's under oath, I mean, I would think he had some credibility problems. What Costello said was he had a meeting with Huey, and that Huey said he wanted him to do a survey of whether to put in slot machines because he was thinking about letting them in to support some kind of a pension reform law. And Costello said this in 1939 when he was indicted for tax fraud, and he repeated this testimony in the 50s in front of the Kefauver United States Senate Investigatory Commission. But it's a very weird thing. Costello said, look, Huey's only plan was to have a legal slot machine system to support some government program. He was never allowed to put the slot machines in without that. And the senator, of course, went in for the kill, and he said, did you put the slot machines in? Didn't you? And Costello said, look, if they were put in, I broke the law. Huey never broke the law. And so he said this in the 50s. Huey couldn't have done him any harm at that point. He had, I'm not sure what reason, if any, he would have to lie about that. But it certainly impeaches the idea that Huey supported the idea of slot machines and had made a deal to have them installed. So that covers the purposes I had of writing the book. A couple of other items. There were some interesting discoveries I made along the way. One, T. Harry Williams wrote that Huey gave speeches as a first-year lawyer and distributed his remarks to other government officials. And I was a first-year lawyer 45 years ago. No one gave a damn what I said. Nobody invited me to speak anywhere. I always wondered, what the hell? Why would he be sending speeches? Where was he speaking? Well, it was the personal papers of Huey Long that Williams did not have. They were not discovered until after his book was published. But the papers reveal that what he was unintentionally talking about was the workers' compensation letters that he wrote to various and sundry government officials. So that answered my question with respect to that. And it was kind of humorous as a first year, remembering what my life was like as a first year lawyer. These newspapers that wrote about the workers' compensation controversy always described Huey as a leading lawyer. And I don't know if they just didn't realize he was in his first year of practice or they just omitted it or what, but I thought that was very interesting. A second interesting thing, just as a random kind of thought, I was in the University of Virginia library looking at the Carter Glass and Harry Byrd papers. And I see that Harry Byrd had this correspondence with his brother, Richard Byrd, the famous explorer of the South Pole. Richard Byrd at the time was head of the National Economy League, kind of the 1930s version of Elon Musk, right? And everybody was favored, let's cut government spending. Okay, there's waste there. Let's cut it, right? I mean, the difficulty is always knowing, what do you cut? Where are you going to cut? I mean, let's cut Wagga-Waggarians, right? I mean, nobody wanted to cut a program that might have some support somewhere. And Harry Byrd was worried that they would cut veterans' benefits. So he wrote to his brother, Richard, he said, look, do not advocate cuts to veteran benefits. Just advocate for a law to give Roosevelt the discretion to cut government spending and then resign from the Economy League before Roosevelt cuts anything. And of course, bless his heart, isn't that a window into a politician's soul? I mean, I'm in favor of economy and government, but I don't want to be blamed for any cuts that hurt anybody. And so he was doing the little sidestep, or asking his brother to help him do the sidestep. Uh, Another interesting thing that I discovered along the way, which wasn't part of my original purpose, was the comparison between Huey and John Parker, who was governor of Louisiana before Huey from 1920 to 1924. They had some of the same goals, but they differed in knowledge and energy and their conception of their responsibilities, and probably most importantly, for their vision for Louisiana. A famous Chicago architect, Daniel Burnham, said, "Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood." Huey made no little plans. All his plans were big, grandiose even, and they were designed to attract public support. And they did attract public support. And then finally, the comparison between Huey and Franklin Roosevelt was also very interesting. I mean, look at this: born in a rural, small town versus privileged aristocrat. You got traveling as a traveling salesman versus touring Europe on vacation. You've got self-education versus Ivy League education. And not only were there significant differences, but their similarities were interesting too. They were both optimistic. They were both enthusiastic. They both had a sense of humor. Um, Roosevelt had physical courage. Huey had intellectual courage, and they both had faced hardship in their youth. I mean, Roosevelt contracted polio, would spend hours trying to move a toe he could not even feel. And Huey, during a rough patch when he was a traveling salesman, had to sleep on park benches in Salvation Army facilities. And he once had to pawn his overcoat and walk 18 miles in the Oklahoma winter in grabbing a few hours of sleep in a cottonseed bin. So they were both extremely hardened politicians, and it's very interesting to see how they interacted and why they really couldn't get along. All right, well, I've gone on longer than I thought, and I want to leave some time for questions if there are any. And so
That's
I'll.
perfectly all right. You covered a lot of ground there. Let me see here. We take you off the spotlight so that we're all a little bit more equal. But yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much. First off, before we kick off the Q&A, for coming and talking to us. You covered a lot of ground, going like with our little biographical thing to start to make sure we're all on the same page, knowing what we're talking about, getting into the nitty gritty of some policy things that were really interesting. Um, Huey Long's an interesting. Well, we're trying to get away from him as a character, see him as a real person in this book, aren't we? But he is a character. He's a Louisianan. Um, and he remains divisive. He remains divisive today. I'm sure he does in the rest of the United States. I can speak to the fact that he was and still is here in Louisiana. Um, I'm going to tip my hand a bit and say that I am a Huey Long fan. I inherited um, first edition of his autobiography from a great aunt who was a ward captain for him in New Orleans. Also worth mentioning, I had a great uncle who was the member of an anti-long club in New Orleans. So, like, even with my own family, just very much butting heads. Um, and then we have a couple of questions that are percolating in from the audience. I wanted to kick it off with one of my own. From the very beginning of your presentation, when you talked about your inspiration to start looking into long around 2008 and looking at the financial crash that we had then and how wealth was concentrating. Um, I feel like wealth has only concentrated more since 2008. You know, we've been seeing like in the news recently how the leaders of the tech industry have, you know, their billion dollar fortunes are doubling and doubling and doubling
Yep.
again the past couple of years. And I also wanted to tie this to the idea that Huey Long actually started his career in the Public Service Commission, because this seems like a foreign concept to me. He went on the attack against utilities and oil companies. And I hope this isn't too political to say, but like we've grown accustomed to the Public Service Commission working hand in hand with utilities, if I could put it that way. Um, and It's really interesting. So my question, and this is probably too big of a question, answer whatever you can. How was Huey Long able to grow his career while um, taking on the rich and powerful. How is he not shut out? Is it a difference in how lobbying worked between the 19 teens and now, or was it that he was able to build more power in a grassroots way?
Yeah, it's hard to judge exactly, but there were a variety of factors that led him to obtain the governorship. Uh, One was the ruling oligarchy of the time was somewhat divided. There was a New Orleans faction, and then there was outgoing Governor Simpson faction, and so they were fighting each other. And New Orleans was not a one-party political faction at the time; they had two factions, and Huey was able to exploit some of those divisions. But I think that Huey approached his politics very logically. So he ran for governor in 1924, and he swept the northern parishes, which were his district for the Public Service Commission. But he didn't do as well in southwest and southern Louisiana, where the Catholic vote was, and he didn't do well in New Orleans at all. And so, in the 4 years between his races, he moved deliberately to shore up his and increase his support in Catholic Southern Louisiana by backing first Joseph Ransdell and then Broussard, who were Catholic candidates and popular. And in 1926, then he made sure that he toured the French parishes with Broussard. And of course, and then he made a deal with their leaders that he would endorse Broussard if they would endorse him for governor in 1928. And even though one of Huey's opponents in 1928 also had supported Broussard, he had not extracted the promise from Broussard's leaders to support him. And so he didn't get all of that support. He also made an effort to obtain increased support in New Orleans, but that was not as successful. But nevertheless, he was able to win election on his second try in any event. So I think he logically analyzed where his weaknesses were and moved to correct them. And I don't want to go too far afield, but if you look at Bernie Sanders, he ran for president in 2016, and this is a worm's eye view, so maybe I'm wrong, but he ran for president in 2016 and lost in the South among a lot of the black Democratic delegates. They all went for Hillary Clinton in 2016. Then he ran again in 2020, and he lost to Joe Biden in the same place. So I don't know what Bernie Sanders did to shore up his support among black Democrats in North and South Carolina in the intervening 4 years. As far as I know, he did nothing to do that. So that's just a failure of analysis that Huey never suffered from, right? He analyzed where he went wrong and how to correct it. And I should point out, too, that Huey obtained power more than many other politicians did from the power of his ideas. So he advocated good roads, concrete roads. Parker and the other oligarchs were building gravel roads at a moderate linear rate, pay as you go. And the traffic was overwhelming those gravel roads. And there were some elements of the oligarchy that wanted good roads. And so he was able to peel off some of those oligarchs to support him because they recognized that roads would be important for the state. And North Carolina had a much bigger road bond program than Huey did years before Huey became governor. And in contrast, the state of Virginia never issued a bond program for roads because Harry Byrd convinced them to go pay as you go. So I think there were certain splits among the oligarchy that Huey was able to take advantage of. And then Huey was able to analyze where he was weak and took concrete action to shore up his support where he had been weak.
No, that's really interesting, and it ties into another question that I had because you talked a bit about the myth that he didn't study.
Yeah.
Because I remember there being a story about, Huey Long didn't have time to wait for the next bar exam, so he kind of barged in and took the bar exam verbally. And that reminds me of the story of Frank Abagnale, the check forger from Catch Me If You Can. And there's a story in that where, when they've caught him and he's explaining how he did everything they did, the FBI says something along the lines of like, well, we figured out everything you did, but we can't figure out how you cheated on the Louisiana bar exam. Frank Abagnale says, no, I just studied my butt off. And so kind of related to that, I wanted to pick up on, looking at this idea of Huey Long is he's studying, he's analyzing where he makes mistakes. And you could view his career progression as kind of a personal growth story and inspiration. Can you speak to the importance then of um, making enemies in that if we're looking at it for life advice?
Making enemies. Well, it's interesting. Huey made enemies, and he never shied away from attacking someone. That's probably one similarity with Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump will never hesitate to attack someone, and Huey did that same thing. And you can wonder if he made his life more difficult as a result of that. His falling out with his lieutenant governor, Paul Sear, prevented him from taking his Senate seat earlier than he did. His attacks on Standard Oil might have um, alienated enough voters that prevented him from becoming governor in 1924. And alternate history buffs can have a field day. If he had won the governorship in 1924 and won a Senate seat in 1926, he would have had 6 years on the national scene before the 1932 presidential election. So I think that in some cases, his selection of enemies was unfortunate and caused him more difficulty. The trouble with judging that with any kind of finality is that his opponents were just insanely opposed to him. I mean, Glenn Johnson writes that, well, Huey wasn't that radical. Other states had given free school books, other states had bond issues for highways. He's not that radical. Well, okay. But what does that say for Huey's opponents? I mean, it means that they were not just reactionary, they were insanely reactionary, and that they shouldn't have opposed him as extensively as they did. I mean, they took all kinds of actions to sabotage his program. And I think he made some enemies, yes, because he was a very intense guy, yes, because he lost his temper, maybe because he had a drinking problem during some years, but maybe because his opponents were unreasonable, reactionary people that just couldn't stand someone from the sticks of Louisiana telling them what to do and how to do it. So it's a tragedy. And then I do want to make a couple of final remarks at the end of the program, because I want to return to that theme of the polarized, divided electorate that it characterized Louisiana at that time.
Right, and we're gonna save time for that. We've got a couple more questions to come through. We
Sure.
have the announcement of our raffle winners, and then well, here's hopefully a fun one from the audience. I mean, fun fun for me because as a Louisianan, this is like one of our pirate treasure stories. Any insights to what happened to the infamous deduct box?
Well, I I I know it didn't disappear because some of the original papers in that deduct box have appeared at private auctions and have been recovered. So Huey had started an investigation against James Farley, Roosevelt's patronage chief and postmaster general, and he had had affidavits from people discussing Farley's inappropriate conduct, and he had put them in the deduct box. And you can now find the original affidavits in Tulane's law library, or not law library, the regular library. So I know the deduct box didn't disappear. The FBI thought that the money was laundered and went to Ralph Hitz in New York or Samuel Zemere, the mortgage holder for the Roosevelt Hotel in New Orleans. And Seymour Weiss was able to take over the hotel and escape mortgage free. And I would point out that the mortgage holder, Sam Zemere, was an opponent of Huey. So it's very interesting that Seymour Weiss may have had some business dealings with Mr. Zemere, even though he was Huey's opponent and Seymour Weiss was Huey's treasurer.
Huh. um, Sort of related. Another question from the audience. Do you think the life or career of an outspoken political figures like Long would be shorter today than it was then?
I think it would be a very interesting experiment for someone else to try. I I I don't know, and I don't have good advice as to what a big political idea today would be. And I can bemoan the politicians today. So, just as an example, just to offer, free opinions, right, unrelated to Huey, right? You had this publicity for the Green New Deal, right? There was going to be this environmental impact, and it was in the news for what, a month, 2 months, and then it's dropped. And if there was criticism of it, was there any amendment to it to try to overcome the criticism? I don't see it. And I would note that political candidates today, especially for president, right, they'll be in the Senate for, a couple of decades or whatnot. Then they'll run for president, and then they'll propose their programs. And I'm thinking, why don't you propose your programs while you're in the Senate and try to develop support for them? And then if you're running for president, you can say, yeah, I'm running for president because they defeated my program in the Senate and I'm trying to develop public support to implement it. I mean, that's kind of what Huey did. But it's also significant, in my view, and not often commented on, that the consensus for Huey's program exceeded Huey's personal popularity. And I don't think either Huey or his opponents realized the significance of that. That his opponents should have gotten behind the program because everybody was in support of that. And Huey maybe should have toned down some of his actions because his personal popularity did not match the popularity of his actual programs. So then finally, just as another random thought, right? You see Kamala Harris, she proposes housing for 3 million people, right? She's going to build 3 million houses. That's her program, right? There's 300 million people in the United States. I mean, Huey's program would talk about housing for 280 million people. He wouldn't be talking around these little dinky programs for 3 million people here and 3 million people there. He would be proposing something that would appeal to the vast middle class and the lower class. And I don't know what those political ideas today are. So I don't want to give advice to somebody today who's thinking about running for office, but I think that I think the problem today is that Huey could get campaign contributions from government contractors and his patronage employees, and you cannot do that today. So how do you run for office today? You've got to advocate a program that appeals to people who have money, or you've got to make a lot of money yourself before you can go into politics. I mean, in 2018, Illinois had 2 billionaires running for governor, neither of whom had held office before they ran for governor. And so it's basically politics is the sport of kings. I mean, what Huey was afraid of was a modern feudalism. That's what he viewed the oligarchy of his time as. We were tending towards a modern economic feudalism where we were going to have the country run by a bunch of wealthy people, and the rest of us were going to be serfs. And so that's what he was opposing. So I don't know where somebody would get the money today to run for office.
Yeah, that's a big question. It's a fun thought experiment. It'd be something we could talk about for a long time. But I wanted to interrupt with we can redistribute a little bit by way of our gift cards to the shop. I wanted to announce the winners. Bill Sage and Demont Lazan and C. Neal. Expect an email. So the book is forthcoming. It comes out from LSU Press next month. The way that we're going to give away the books is that you will receive an email from the shop manager of the 1850 house with your gift card information. If you're local, you can come down to the shop. If you're not local, you can order it online. And with that, I wanted to pause for a moment to see if there's any more questions from the audience. I think I had one more that might be an easy one, I hope. And then we'll turn it over to our speaker, Thomas Patterson, for final remarks. Okay, so this one I'll go ahead and ask while we're waiting for more questions from the audience. Why didn't the governor of Tennessee want the state police there? This is something that we're used to seeing in football games, that the opposing team, especially in college games, like the state police. The Texas State Troopers travel with Texas A&M and the University of Texas, don't they?
Yeah,
Uh, yeah,
I think it was just hostility to Huey himself, right?
fair enough.
So, and I think the game warden may have figured, heck, I'm going to get on the bandwagon
Right.
because it's very interesting to see the Nashville newspapers. I mean, first, oh, there might be 1,000 people coming for the game, and then midweek, then they talked about how Huey negotiated a special rate with the railroads so that he could take all the students, and then they talked about how he loaned every student at LSU $7, $6 for the plane fare, and $1 for food. He made all his associates empty his pockets for cash, and then they talked about that it looks like he was going to bring 5,000, and then finally they were saying it's going to be 7,000. It's the largest peacetime excursion in United States history. So they really it really took off like it was just a big plan, a lot of fun, and good publicity for Huey.
No, that's a good, simple answer. And with that, I wanted to thank you again for your time. I wanted to thank everyone in
Sure.
the audience for turning out. Everyone, a final reminder that if you know anybody who didn't register in time, reach out to me. I can forward the recording link to anyone who was interested but wasn't able to register in time for the live presentation. And with that, I'd like to turn it over for final remarks to our presenter tonight.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't have too much more to say, and I appreciate the questions and so forth. I think that one thing maybe I haven't stressed enough is that Huey had a vision for Louisiana. And one of the professors at LSU, writing in retrospect, said that LSU was expanding while other universities were retrenching during the Great Depression, and that there was a tremendous influx of talent at LSU during Huey's reign. And he said that the roots of that influx of talent were found in Huey's very complex makeup. And it was an imaginativeness that could see beyond the band and football fame. It was an imaginativeness that sought excellence at LSU. And I think that I saw interspersed throughout his career, he had a vision. He had a vision of New Orleans doubling in population and battling New York to be the top port in the United States. He wanted Louisianans to travel on modern highways. He wanted them to get educated. He wanted them to have excellent medical care. And the electorate of Louisiana was divided, polarized, and obviously violent. And it ended in a big tragedy of his assassination. And I think the proper way to read All the King's Men is as a tragedy. And I think that the real tragedy beyond Huey's personal death was perhaps the death of his vision for Louisiana and maybe for the United States. He was for equal opportunity. He was for coping with change, and he was for avoiding this modern economic feudalism that he foresaw as the potential. So if you look at the United States today, we have a polarized, sometimes violent electorate. And we have the same need to cope with change because it's only accelerating. We have the same need to cope with the economic consolidation that's taking place. We have, I think, a task to try to avoid becoming a feudalistic country instead of a democratic country. And my hope is that maybe if we study Huey's career and the tragedy of Louisiana politics during that time, maybe we can avoid a similar tragedy in the United States. So anyway, thanks for inviting me, and thanks everybody for listening, and thanks for the questions.
Yeah, thanks again for coming and talk to us. Thanks again to the audience for coming. Reach out to me if you have any questions about this. Keep an eye out in your email for our raffle winners. Also, for the rest of us, you'll get an email with a link to the recording, along with an invitation to register for next month's second Thursday lecture. And thanks again to our presenter tonight, Thomas Patterson.
Great.
We'll keep an eye out for his book when it comes out from LSU Press next month. Thanks again.
All right. Thanks, Chris.